Picture the 6 most powerful people on the planet sitting in a room, and someone slides the same machine across the table to all of them. Now watch what they do. One of them sees a gold mine, another sees a weapon, one sees a medical device, one sees a business opportunity, and one sees a dangerous tool. Same machine, wildly different things. But that machine is artificial intelligence. The 6 people are the leaders deciding what their country should do with it. And before you tune out and tell yourself that this is a foreign policy thing that doesn't touch you, there's something that most people tend to miss. Whichever of these visions ends up shaping the rules, the chips, the power grids, and the laws is going to define what the next 30 years feel like to live inside. Your hospital, your kid's school, your tax forms, the face scan at the airport, what you can read online. So in this video, I want to walk you through what each leader actually believes about AI based on my own work advising governments and which of these future you actually want to live inside. If you find this content interesting, make sure to subscribe. Let's start with the loudest one in the room. Donald Trump talks about AI the way that an oil baron talks about an untapped field. To him, this is really a resource problem. So cheap power, big buildings, fewer rules, harder negotiations. Whoever does the most of all 4 wins. And the White House released an AI action plan in July of 2025. The framing of the entire document is winning. 28 pages of scripted regulations, build faster, and make sure that American AI rather than someone else's becomes the global default. Now, his thinking is straightforward. If AI is the next industrial revolution, the country with the cheapest furnace wins. And the pace of action has been relentless. So in November 2025, Trump launched what he calls the Genesis mission, aiming AI at scientific discovery. In December, Trump then signed an executive order setting up a bespoke Justice Department task force to challenge states who want to make regulatory restrictions on AI. There's also the usual dosage of culture war language threaded throughout all of this too. So Trump frames the AI race as a fight over values. He says that if China wins, the world ends up using systems built around surveillance and central control. If America wins, on the other hand, the systems carry free speech and individual liberty in their bones. And to do that, we need to strip AI systems of any woke language to ensure that it doesn't reflect any views on DEI or climate change. And whether you find that framing convincing or not, watch what it does. It turns a chip and energy story into a value story, which makes it much easier to sell to the average voters who, no disrespect, would maybe not have an immediate opinion on chip supply chains. But where the plan still gets shakier is in the actual machinery. The same administration aggressively cutting tech-focused State Department staff and National Science Foundation funding is also the one that is promising to win on talent and global standards. So whether the big rhetoric and the bureaucracy can be reconciled is generously an open question. But the man that Trump wants to beat sees the whole picture differently. Xi Jinping, the leader of China, does not talk about AI like it's a market. He talks about it like it's a faculty of the government, something that the state owns and aims in the very same way that the state owns and aims its army. And Xi's New Year message in January framed as a year of AI and chip breakthroughs. And ultimately, the message is this: powerful technology is what he calls a sharp weapon for the modern state. And the reference is historical. So in his mind, whoever held the technological edge in the past centuries essentially got to rewrite the world's rules. Xi, from what we know, reads AI as the equivalent edge for this age, and he intends China to hold it. Now, the problem with usually understanding Chinese AI policy is that it's quite opaque and very hard to get your hands on actual figures and data. However, researchers at the Carnegie Endowment identified 4 phases since 2017 that are quite telling. First, there was a boom with subsidies pouring in and essentially no rulebook existing. Then from 2020, a crackdown era when the party reasserted control over its own tech giants and even slapped Alibaba with a $2.8 billion antitrust fine. Then came a quieter catch-up phase after ChatGPT scared everyone, where Beijing softened restrictions to let domestic firms close the gap. Then, in early 2025, a wildcard happened. A Chinese model named DeepSeek matched American frontier capabilities at essentially just a fraction of the training cost and scrambled the conversation overnight. That has changed Xi's posture almost immediately from defensive to confident. He's reportedly invited founders to senior CCP meetings, and the state has launched an initiative aimed at pushing their technology into clinics, classrooms, and provincial bureaucracies. And the moment hasn't faded, because just last month, DeepSeek released its V4 model, but this time running on Huawei chips rather than Nvidia, which was always the thing that the Americans try to avoid. And people tend to get this one thing wrong, because as Chinese capability has caught up, control of it has gone up alongside it, not down. Reportedly, investors who even want a meeting with DeepSeek leadership now even have to get vetted by provincial officials first. Some of the company's own engineers are said to even have handed over their passport because what they know is now being treated as sensitive enough to count as state matter. In addition to that, she has been pushing for new labeling rules for AI-generated content, so the stuff where you don't know whether it's real or not, to come into force to essentially protect national narratives. And a digital ID scheme is being built that funnels more data about citizens straight to the government. The pattern is consistent. When the party feels weak, it loosens. When it feels strong, it tightens. So AI in Xi's hands really appears to be a lever, and the lever belongs to the state. That instinct is exactly what the next leader on this list has built her entire approach to oppose, or at least that was the plan. Ursula von der Leyen trained as a medical doctor before she went into politics. She brings it up every time she talks about AI, and that's not an accident. When she pitches the technology, she often opens up with a clinical example, like AI can spot breast cancer on a mammogram earlier and more reliably than a human radiologist. That image is the foundation of her whole frame. AI as emblematic for a medical instrument, so powerful when used carefully, dangerous when used carelessly, and worth noting if patients don't trust it. And the actual European policy reflects this doctor's reflex. So the EU's AI Act, which kicked in during August 2024, is generally a lot more restrictive compared to what other countries are doing. And von der Leyen calls these guardrails, but critics, particularly AI firms, call them red tape. Both descriptions are partly right. And this comes at a moment where the AI race is really at peak heat, because Brussels has started blinking. In November last year, the Commission proposed what it's calling the Digital Omnibus, which is essentially a fancy way of saying that it wants to delay parts of its own AI Act. So the country that wrote the global rulebook on AI ethics is currently arguing about whether the rulebook is actually arriving on time, probably because they do have some fears around slowing down too much vis-a-vis the US and China and other countries. That tells you something about the squeeze that von der Leyen is in. She pushed back on the idea that Europe had already lost the AI race, saying that the race is, as a matter of fact, far from settled. The honest read is that von der Leyen's vision around AI is probably one of the most ethical ones across the world, but it's also the slowest. And now, even she is being pulled towards delay. The question that obviously hangs over all of it is whether a regulation-first model can keep pace with two competitors who have explicitly designed themselves not to be slowed down by ethics. That question used to feel theoretical. It doesn't anymore. But just next door to it, the Brits are trying out a totally different approach. Keir Starmer's pitch on AI is probably one of the least cosmic ones of the six. So where the others are talking about civilization, sovereignty, and the future of humanity, Starmer is essentially talking about a Tuesday morning at the council office. When he launched the UK's AI Opportunities Action Plan in January 2025, the framing was that AI would underpin what he called a decade of national renewal. In practice, that mostly meant fixing the unglamorous parts of how the British state currently works. Faster planning consultations, AI tools that can help teachers cut down lessons prep time, cameras feeding into systems that detect potholes, or diagnostic tools used inside the National Health Service to spot cancer earlier and discharge patients faster. The tagline is administrative revolution rather than industrial context. So Starmer wants to drag the plumbing of government into the present, and he sees AI as a tool that makes that politically possible. And that's not a bad thing, because it makes AI much more actionable rather than having conversations about the Terminator or Skynet. And it should be said that the UK government is spending big money on that. So the AI Action Plan committed to 50 recommendations, including building so-called AI growth zones that would help essentially fast-track planning approvals. They also committed themselves to a 20-fold increase in public computing power by 2030, and they also launched new partnerships with private firms that would foresee millions of investments. And a year on, the government's own scorecard says that 38 out of these 50 commitments have already been met. A new supercomputer has now been built in Bristol, and a new sovereign AI unit has been formally set up. So progress is real, if uneven. Now, two things make Starmer's framing distinctive. So first of all, he's openly cautious about what he calls unaccountable tech barons, which essentially sends a signal that even as Britain is trying to court the industry, the state still intends to set the terms. Second, his AI vision is tied directly to public services rather than increasing public wealth. And he keeps emphasizing that the productivity gains from AI should show up as shorter NHS waits and better classrooms, not just as bigger margins for Silicon Valley subsidiaries. The risk in the strategy is the same risk that the British state has run into 100 times before. And that could be we start a fancy, exceptional pilot that works really well in one hospital, but then maybe doesn't scale to 100 others. And Starmer will need to convince a very skeptical electorate that the investments is worth it before the next election, which is a much faster timeline than the technology will plausibly deliver on. So that's 3 flavors of liberal democratic AI in 3 different configurations. The next vision on this list comes from somewhere very different. Vladimir Putin has been talking about AI longer than almost any other world leader. His most famous line, that whoever leads an AI becomes the ruler of the world, is still doing a lot of rhetorical work since he made it in 2017. Now, the piece you have to grasp about Putin's framing is that it isn't really about productivity or growth at all. It's what he sees about survival. So he's described AI as a tool for, in his words, saving Russian civilization from a West that he thinks is spiritually collapsing. At a conference in Moscow last November, he argued that AI models are neutral, but they're shaped by whoever trains them. And the values inside the model get exported to anyone who uses it. So Russia, in his telling, has to train its own models on Russian thinkers and Russian texts. Otherwise, it ends up being dependent on foreign systems carrying foreign worldviews. This is what he calls worldview sovereignty. Now, the analysts who actually track Russian capability have made a pretty hard-nosed observation. Russia, despite its sabling rattling, is not by any honest measure a frontier player. Its venture capital system is tiny, and estimates even put its AI startup count well below the thousands. Its real strengths sit in military applications, so things like unmanned vehicles tested in Syria and the Poseidon underwater nuclear-capable drone. That means the rhetoric is way ahead of the engineering. Putin talks like AI is the deciding battle of human history, but the data suggests that Russia will be a regional player in narrow military niches. And that's about it. Late last year, the Saudi cabinet officially declared 2026 the year of artificial intelligence. The decision came directly from Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, usually known as MBS. And it's part of a much larger bet on what Saudi Arabia should be in the 21st century. While the other leaders pitch AI's competition, control, ethics, plumbing, or armor, MBS pitches it as something closer to a national rebirth. The phrase he keeps using is inclusive dreaming. So he invites what he calls dreamers, that is, innovators, investors, and thinkers, to essentially come to the kingdom and help build what he describes as a new global normal. So the vocabulary feels a lot closer to national renewal and an investment pitch. And the numbers behind that investment are enormous and growing. Saudi AI companies pulled in $9.1 billion in funding in 2024 alone. The kingdom's AI authority has now trained over 1 million Saudi citizens in AI just within the last 12 months. That eclipses what we have done in Europe or, for example, in the United States. Then in May 2025, MBS announced Humane, which is an AI company owned by the country's sovereign wealth fund. Early this year, then, the kingdom opened up Hexagon, which is currently the world's largest government data center with a capacity of 400 megawatts, which is roughly the capacity that half of San Francisco draws at its peak in a single building. Then came a Washington trip in which MBS landed in DC and walked out with a $1 trillion Saudi investment commitment to the United States. What these initiatives show is that Saudi Arabia is actively pitching itself as the world's third AI hub, just after America and China. And the strategic positioning is actually pretty clever. So Trump pitches American AI, Xi pitches Chinese AI, von der Leyen pitches European AI, but MBS pitches Saudi Arabia as the bridge. So the ground where East and West can both deploy, both invest, both negotiate, and the Saudis will provide the essential compute infrastructure for that. So the Saudi vision might be one of the most ambitious of the 6 in scope, but also the one with the most consequential implications. Now stop for a second and look at what these 6 visions taken together actually tell you. There's something that becomes quite obvious when you put all 6 pitches next to each other. None of these leaders are really arguing about artificial intelligence per se. Trump uses AI to argue for cheap energy regulation and tariffs, thinks he won it anyway. Xi uses AI to argue for state coordination and ideological control, thinks the CCP won it anyway. Von der Leyen uses AI to argue for a regulated social market, which is essentially the European project in miniature. Starmer uses AI to argue for fixing British public services, which is the labor pitch in technological clothing. Then Putin uses AI to argue for civilizational separateness, which is his entire worldview restated. And finally, MBS uses AI to argue that Saudi Arabia is open for business. The technology itself is real, and the arguments around it are mostly the same arguments that these leaders were already having before AI existed. AI just gives them a fresh vocabulary, more urgency, and a much larger budget. Which means that when you watch these six talk about AI, you're not really watching a debate about technology alone, but much rather about values dressed in technical clothing and a language of inevitability. And the version that wins, it will quietly lock those values in for a generation. So the more useful question really isn't about who's going to win the AI race. It's which of these futures you'd actually want to wake up inside. Pick the one you'd rather live in, and you've told yourself something very honest about your own politics. Thanks for watching. If this video gave you a useful frame, consider subscribing. We actually also produced another video where we deal with the geography of AI powered. If you found this content interesting, you might enjoy that one as well. You can access it over here. Till the next time.